Professor Velesco is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science in London. He has an exceptional breadth of experience, which I will present briefly in a moment, and we are incredibly delighted and fortunate to have him here with us today. It's one of the main goals of Idea Center is to combine theoretical education with real-life political and public policy experience. In organizing this conference, we could not think of a better fit than Professor Velesco to hold today's keynote speech. Rarely does someone combine academic excellence with real-world public policy and political experience at the highest level, as Professor Velesco does and did in his past. Mr. Velesco was a presidential candidate in Chile in 2013. He also was the Minister of Finance of Chile between March 2006 and March 2010, at the height of the global financial crisis. During his career, Professor Velesco has served as a consultant to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and to government, central banks, and private businesses around the world. With regards to his academic career, Mr. Velesco held positions in Columbia University, the Harvard Kennedy School, and New York University. He's the author of many academic articles, several academic books, and even 2 novels. And I don't know how you can do so much in so little time. So I know that oftentimes we Israelis like to think of ourselves and of our problems as special. I do hope that Professor Velesco, with his overwhelming experience, international experience, would help us put things in a bit of context and perspective, while still maybe show us why we are nevertheless special in our own way. Professor Velesco, please.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Congratulations to Ideas for launching a center. I think I will not surprise you if I say that throughout the world, politics is in a very bad way. That's true of Latin America, where I come from. That's true of the United Kingdom, where I live. That's true of much of Europe, much of Asia, and certainly this part of the world is not unique in having escaped that. On the contrary, we see some of the same problems here as we see elsewhere in the planet. Sorry that I will speak in English. My Hebrew is not particularly good. I will say, however, that yes, Israel and Chile, where I'm from, are very different in many respects, but we're similar in 2 respects. Once upon a time, we used to have strong and successful center-left politics. That's not necessarily the case anymore, but we hope that will be the case again in the future. And second of all, as I was coming from the airport toward the ocean, the climate and the beach and the architecture makes me feel right at home. This could perfectly well be any of the coastal cities in Chile or Argentina. So at least from a political and a geographic point of view, it is a delight to be here. All right, I'm going to talk about populism. In the world today, it is hard to talk about anything without talking about populism. And what I'll do is this. I've prepared a lecture which is not boring and formal, I hope, but it is a lecture. But I don't want to speak for too long because much of the fun, of course, is in the interaction, the questions, and the answers. So I will begin. If I say anything particularly wrong, particularly outrageous, please feel free to interrupt me. I've been to this country before. I know people are not shy, so please feel free to say what you please, whenever you please. All right, so let's begin with a picture, actually 9 pictures. This is an educated audience. I will not tell you who those people are, except that they either are heads of state, have been heads of state, or wish to be heads of state. Some are men, some are women, mostly men. Some are from rich countries, some are from poor countries, some are from the east, some are from the west. They have one thing in common. I would call them, maybe not everybody would call them, populist leaders. So I want to talk about these guys. You know, the lesser known ones, so that's AMLO from Mexico. Down there is Bolsonaro from Brazil, Orban from Hungary. The guy with the funny red hat is no longer with us, fortunately. His name is Chavez. He used to run Venezuela and drove Venezuela into the ground. I want to argue that in spite of the fact that some of these guys are from the left, some of these guys are from the right, some are dead, some are alive, some come from poor countries or rich countries, they share a political feature, okay? They are all populist leaders. And in the next 45 minutes or so, I want to argue that there's a clear political sense in which this is a meaningful category. Some people complain that, populism is too vague, it's too general a concept. I want to argue that it can be used in vague ways, but it doesn't have to be. There is a clear sense in which people engage in populist politics. And I want to argue that we have some reasons that help us understand why this is so. And also some wrong theories as to why populism is resurgent in the world today. Of course, the reason why I feel qualified to talk about this is I come from Latin America and we invented the damn thing, right? If we had... Oh, yes, we did. Yes, we did. Well, the Americans say that in the late 19th century in the US, there was some populism. But, these guys were all doing populism before the State of Israel existed, okay? So who are these people? That's Perón from Argentina. The guy in the middle is Vargas from Brazil. And the guy from the right is Cárdenas in Mexico. They all governed the respective countries in the 1930s or in the 1940s. So, they've been around for a while, right? If Latin America had property rights of these guys and could charge a royalty every time a populist imitates them, we would be a very rich nation or rich continent indeed. Regrettably, there's things that you can patent, there are things that you cannot patent. Populism is not patentable. I wish it were, okay? As I was beginning to write about populism 3 or 4 years ago, and I've been at the LSE for a couple of years, I began looking at the literature on the subject, and I was surprised to find that in 1968 the LSE had a conference on the subject. So this is my little advertisement for my institution. And we Latin Americans invented it in 38. The LSE was thinking about it in 68. Here we are, half a century later. And much to my surprise, the volume from the conference began with those words. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of populism. That's not Marx, that's not Engels, that is the LSE director in 1968. Okay, so the idea that populism is a specter and the idea that populism is haunting us did not begin in 1938 in Latin America, did not begin last week in Brazil or India or Venezuela. It's been around for a while. A few numbers. You may dispute that these countries are populist, and this is a very conservative estimate. And of course, I've omitted a few. But a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and for Europe, it is all the countries where today there's a coalition government in which at least one of the parties in government is populist. That gives you 170 million people in Europe who live under populist or semi-populist regimes. Add up those numbers, that's nearly 2.4 billion people. That's about a third of humanity. Okay, that's a lot of people. Okay, so populism may be all kinds of things, but it is not unsuccessful. About a third of humanity today lives under regimes that I will not feel any compunction to call populist. So we're talking about a big subject, okay, and a worrying subject too. Let me dig a little deeper now. The common or a common distinction that is made is between economic and political populism. And in Latin America, we've had both, but perhaps the more common version was economics. And of course, Israel had a bit of this, 25 years ago. Governments that borrow too much, spend too much, eventually you have too much inflation, right? A balance of payments crisis, an inflation crisis, a debt crisis, a banking crisis, or all of the above put together. Israel never quite was in the Latin American category for hyperinflation, but you guys almost got there, okay? So another similarity. And of course, there's a political populism. And I want to argue today that political populism is a distinct category. That it may involve economic populism, but it doesn't have to involve economic populism. There's a famous paper, let me get a little, somewhat academic here. There's a famous paper by two economists, one German, one Chilean, in which they define populism as a way of doing economic policy, and this is about economics, in which you emphasize growth, you emphasize income redistribution, you don't do it very well, and eventually you get into trouble. And populist economic policies don't get into trouble because they are left-wing or right-wing. They get into trouble because they're short-sighted. They're typically unsustainable. So you get some gain today at the expense of some pain tomorrow. As an academic, one big question is, why do people choose that? If you know there's a pretty good chance that your country will go down the drain 3 years from now or 2 years from now, why do you choose to have a party today? I will return to that question toward the end of my words today. But what I think is interesting in the world today is that not all populist regimes from a political point of view are necessarily populist from an economic point of view. I would argue that Orban in Hungary is a populist. I would argue that Bolsonaro in Brazil is a populist. I would argue that Mr. Morales, who just fled Bolivia a couple of weeks ago, was a populist in Bolivia. Nonetheless, these guys, Orban is from the right, Morales is from the left, Bolsonaro is from the very far right. They've been quite orthodox when it comes to economic policy, especially to fiscal policy. So one novelty, if you wish, of the world today is that you can have political populism without having economic populism, which is worrisome, because once upon a time you knew that they would muck up the economy quickly enough, and eventually they would be out of office. Nowadays they're populistic and sometimes authoritarian, but they don't necessarily screw up the economy, at least not right away. And of course that makes them live longer. And as a result, the implicit threat, and there is a threat, can be more lasting, more persistent, and more dangerous than before.
Professor,
yes.
Can you say one more word on Morales? Because
sure.
The common wisdom is that he was basically a socialist.
Morales was basically a socialist. There are two things to remember about Morales, aside from the fact that he had a fairly unusual brand of socialism. He was not necessarily a man that was going about nationalizing things, although he did enlarge the presence of the state in the economy. The two striking things about Morales that you want to remember is this. Bolivia has been an independent country since the 1820s. Bolivia is the country on the planet that has had more heads of state per year of life. Okay? There was a period of life in Bolivia when Bolivia had more presidents than years. Okay? So that means that on average governments lasted for less than 1 year. The amazing thing is that until Morales became president of Bolivia 14 years ago, Bolivia, which is a country where 50% of the population or more is of indigenous origin, had never had a president who was not of European ancestry. Never. Okay? So Bolivia looks like South Africa. And we know that's not a good state of affairs. So whatever his faults, Morales was the first guy with dark skin and an Aymara heritage to be president of Bolivia. And of course that gave him legitimacy, and that made him popular for a long time. That's the good side of Morales. The bad side of Morales is that the Constitution said that he could be president for 2 terms. He managed to be president for 3, and he was trying to be president for 4. And he did this in ways, this may be a good introduction to what I want to say, that are quite typical of the illiberal and sometimes authoritarian feature of populism. The Constitution of Bolivia said 2 terms and you go home. You know what Morales did? Very creative man. He changed the country's name. Okay? It used to be the Republic of Bolivia. It is now the Multicultural Republic of Bolivia. He went to the Supreme Court and he said, clearly the 2 terms applied to the old country. But look, we have a new country now. It has a new name. And the Supreme Court, which of course was packed with the people that he had appointed, said, yes, of course, Mr. President, it is a new country. So Morales was allowed to run for a 3rd term. Okay? Don't try that at home. It's not a good idea. But then, of course, there was an election about a month ago, and he needed to get, I think 45%, I'm not sure, but he needed to get to a certain threshold to avoid a 2nd round. At 7 p.m. on the day of the election, the exit polls were showing that he was about 3 points short of that threshold, so there would be a 2nd round. And if there was a 2nd round, he would probably lose, because all the other guys would gang up upon him. And curiously enough, the computers went silent at about 7:30 p.m. And no reports of any vote tallies were issued by the government until 2 days later, where magically he was 0.5% over the required threshold. Okay? At that point, the country went crazy. There were all kinds of protests, some justified, some not, some unjustified, some violent, some peaceful, and eventually Morales left. The ugly part of it all, of course, is that he left after a prod from the armed forces. We had hoped that the guys in uniform were out of politics in Bolivia. When the country became quite chaotic, the guys in uniform said, Mr. President, please go home. I'm not go home. Please, get out of the way. And Morales is today in Mexico, okay? Where the Mexican government, which has a very bad economic situation, had a week of, press focused on Morales, not on the economy. So, this is what an economist would call a Pareto superior transaction. Bolivia gained, Mexico gained as well, right? But Morales is an interesting case because he is a populist who in the beginning was in fact quite democratic. And in fact, as I said earlier, he made a change for Bolivia that was a good change. Of course, he overstayed his welcome big time. Now, I've been using loosely the concept of economic populism, and one of you is probably thinking, what the hell is this guy talking about? He hasn't told me what that means. What is economic populism? What are the components, and why does it make sense as a category? I want to argue that economic populism is three things. It's a denial of complexity, a denial of pluralism, and often, not always, but often, a denial or rejection of the checks and balances that are essential to liberal democracy. And I want to argue that this is a slippery slope. If you engage in one, you're likely to engage in two, and if you engage in two, you're likely to engage in three. Let me explain. Complexity. The world is messy, right? Many of you are academics, scholars, students, researchers, journalists. We earn a living, if you're a professor like me, by trying to understand things that are complex. Our host here is a think tank. The reason why we have think tanks in the world is that the world is complicated. We have to study it. We need data. We need alternative hypotheses. And we need people to think about what the hell it is that we know and don't know about the world. The big questions in politics and economics are all complicated questions. What causes crime? Hard question. What are the implications of migration? Hard question. What should we do about abortion? Hard question, right? Which are thought about and fought over east, west, north, south, poor and rich. What do populists do? Well, they deny the world is complicated. They tell you the world is simple. Not only are problems simple, but they have simple solutions. Migration is a very messy problem. Migration has to do with warfare, has to do with economics, with politics, with society, with climate change. Trump tells you, oh no, it's very simple. There are these bad guys coming across the border, and what you do is you build a wall. Stupid policy, great politics. I learned how brilliant a politician Trump was when about a year ago, I walked into my house, tired after one long day of work, and I found my son, who was 9 now, he was 8 or 7.5 at the time, with my iPad on YouTube, and he had found a game for children his age, which involved gathering wooden blocks, and guess what? Building a wall, right? To keep the bad guys at bay, okay? As a politician, which also I have been, I had campaign teams, and strategists and posters, and we came up with brilliant slogans that only my mother knew about. Here's a guy who has a slogan that is so good that a 9-year-old child or 7-year-old child across the world in central Chile knows about. Political brilliance. Bad policy, good politics. There was a guy who, a German sociologist who was the president of the London School of Economics many years ago, at the time, in fact in the 60s, at the time of that conference, who, as part of the conference said, let me make it simple for you. Democracy is complex, populism is simple. We have democracy because the world is complex and we have different views, right? Populists say, oh, no need for that. I will elaborate in a minute. There's a quote that I like very much from H.L. Mencken, an essayist and journalist and thinker from the US of the late 19th and early 20th century. Mencken once said, for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And if you think about Boris Johnson, if you think about Modi in India, or about Trump in the US, most of the things that they propose are clear, they're simple, and they're wrong. Now, this has one implication for people like me. I run a school of public policy, so I'm training people to have expertise. You need expertise when the matter at hand is complex. And if the populists are rising in the world, and if the populistic way of thinking about the world is rising, well, if the world is simple, what the hell do we need experts for? In the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom, one of the most striking facts was a statement by a man called Michael Gove, who is nowadays the Brexit minister in the current cabinet. Very educated man, went to Oxford, has all the right credentials to be a minister. I remember in an exchange with journalists, one of them said, but you know, minister, all the economists from Oxford and Cambridge and LSE and all the experts say that Brexit is terrible for the economy. And Gove replied, Britain has had enough of experts. Who want experts? There's a famous quote by Trump also, which I don't have here, at a press conference. He said, you know, I've always wanted to say this. I hate the experts. They're really bad. Now, I have a problem, personal problem, you see, because I'm the dean of a school that produces experts. So I keep telling my students that if the current state of affairs persists, you know, we're increasing the supply of experts, but the demand for experts is going down. The economists in the room will know that this means that the price of experts will go down. My poor students will not be paid very much. And I say that lightly, but I don't mean it 100% lightly, because, you know, when my tooth aches, I go to a dentist. I don't go to a friend. I have some very good friends with whom I like to drink beer, but I go to a dentist, even if the dentist is not a nice person, because the dentist has some expertise. The devaluation of expertise is very typical of populist regimes, and it is a very dangerous thing indeed. Because if the world is complex and the solutions we provide are simple and stupid, well, the toothache will persist, and eventually I will have to pull out the tooth. And that's exactly what's happening today in many countries of the world. Now, if the world is complex, you may have one view, and you may have a different view, and you may have a different view. And that's perfectly legitimate, because it is complex, and we have different points of view, we approach problems from different corners, etc. And that is why democratic systems thrive, or I should say democratic systems are built on the idea of pluralism. Pluralism is complexity plus legitimacy. Let me repeat that. Pluralism is complexity plus legitimacy. Complexity because we have many points of view, and legitimacy because it is okay to have many points of view. If you think differently than I, it is not because you are the agent of some evil foreign power. It is simply because you have different information or a different evaluation of the available evidence or a different point of view. Well, if you're a populist and you think that the world is simple, and as a result of that simplicity, the populist has one clear answer, well, anybody else who has a different answer cannot be a decent person. It's obvious. You know, if you don't want to build a wall, oh, you must be, you know, a Mexican rapist. You know, Donald Trump is on record having said that most Mexicans who come to the United States are rapists, right? So the idea that other views are legitimate goes down the drain. And with that, the very center of democracy, which is the idea of pluralism, also goes down the drain. What's the solution to this? Well, if the other guys are all illegitimate, you have to throw them out. There was a very frightening interview recently in the New Yorker of the political consultant who trained Steve Bannon, who in turn trained Donald Trump. And this political consultant said, most current elections are the contest between the guy who says, I have a 10-point plan to deal with a difficult problem, and the guy who says, they're all thieves, they're all crooks, throw them out. To which he added, in 9 out of 10 times, the second candidate wins. Think of Hillary Clinton, highly trained, highly sophisticated. She had a 10-point plan for everything, but she lost the election. So there's a slippery slope from the denial of complexity to the denial of legitimacy. Now, because people who have other views are illegitimate, they're necessarily the enemy. And the only difference, or perhaps the main difference between left-wing and right-wing populism is in who is the enemy. Left-wing populism is two-pronged. Fancy people call that dyadic. There is one good political agent, the people, the nation, we, the good guys, and there's one bad political agent, the elite. And of course, politics is all about throwing the elite out the window. If you want sort of textbook left-wing populism, go online and read the speeches by Chavez or Maduro in Venezuela, right? It is all about evil elite, good people, and of course the good people are never consulted. The good people simply express their goodness through me. Who am I? Well, the charismatic leader who speaks on behalf of the people to do what? To get rid of the elite. Right-wing populism is more difficult because it has an anti-elitist element, but if you are, you know, a billionaire property developer who inherited millions like Trump, it is hard to be entirely against the elite because obviously you are part of the elite. So right-wing populism needs to construct another villain, some other political actor that can be called names and delegitimized. And that political actor is typically a minority, religious, ethnic, political. It could be a sexual minority. If you read the New York Times of today, which I did in the plane coming here, President Bolsonaro of Brazil is making an anti-gay agenda one of the main things in his platform. Okay? Why? Where did it come from? We have no idea, but some poster told him he would probably benefit because he needed some evil people to fight, and he decided that the evil people would be gays. Okay? And so a very famous gay reporter was held there and attacked the other day on a television studio. Unbelievable stuff. But the point is, you need an enemy. If you have migration, of course, the migrants will be the enemy. And that's why the wall, that's why migration is central to the Brexit debate, and that's why migration is central to many of the populist debates. So, right-wing populism is not two-pronged, right-wing populism is three-pronged. You've got the people, you've got the elite, and then you've got the bad guys. And the bad guys are the migrants, the minority, the foreigners, gays, anybody who can be targeted, pigeonholed, and abused. Now, this is the third component of the slippery slope, because if you believe the world's complex, then you have pluralism. But to preserve pluralism, liberal democracy invented something called institutions and checks and balances. Liberal democracy, we say liberal and democracy, two words, because liberal democracy has two components. Democracy is about majority rule. We have elections, and if you have two, the guy who gets 50 votes plus one, 50% plus one, that person wins. That's majority rule, that's democracy. But that's not liberal democracy necessarily. Liberal democracy is majority rule joined with protections for the minority. Because there are certain things that you do not allow the majority to do against the minority. The majority cannot, win an election by one vote and then say, as of now, the minority will have no political rights. Or as of now, the minority are no longer citizens. Or as of now, the minority are no longer entitled to government transfers. Equal treatment is of the essence of a democracy, and that's the liberal part of democracy, right? So what happens? You believe that the minority is entitled to that liberal protection if the minority is a legitimate actor. But if you think that the minority is not a legitimate actor because they're clearly wrong, and they could only be wrong because they're acting on behalf of somebody else, not acting on behalf of the common good, well, why the hell should they then have political rights? So more often than not, and you're seeing that in the Philippines, you're seeing that in Hungary, you're seeing that to some extent in Poland, you could argue that to some extent, you've seen it in the United States, there's an erosion of democratic checks and balances. So you saw it very much, for example, in Bolivia, in which a regime that began being democratic ended up being quasi-authoritarian. And you've seen it to the hilt, of course, in Venezuela. Venezuela is a country in which the Supreme Court is no longer autonomous, in which the Electoral Court is no longer autonomous, and in which the parliament, in which the opposition has a majority, has been stripped of all powers. And Maduro installed a parallel parliament, which has all the power, and of course, that was never elected. The elected parliament has zero power. There's no freedom of the press, there are no free elections, and as a result, Venezuela was Latin America's model democracy 30 years ago. Venezuela is today an outright dictatorship. And it began very much along the very same slope that I've been describing. It doesn't always end like that, but it often ends like that. So one thing to remember about political populism is that it is a system by which democracies die, or at least a system by which democracies can be severely weakened. And it's important to keep that in mind because often you will see in the press, particularly in the sort of more left-leaning press, and this is very much part of the debate where I come from in Latin America, the idea that populism is in fact a counterforce to the failures of democracy. So in Bolivia, people would say, oh, democracy has been captured by the rich, or it's been captured by people of a certain ethnicity, and populism is a counter to that. Maybe in the beginning. But when you begin to run for 4 consecutive terms, violating the Constitution, or doing so in a Mickey Mouse way by changing the name of the country, or, clearly you're not a force in favor of democracy, you have become a force that is putting brakes on democracy, or perhaps destroying democracy outright. So that's very key. One guy who said this very clearly, if you want sort of a reading suggestion, there's a German political theorist at Princeton in the US, a guy called Miller, with a lovely little book called What is Populism? And he makes this last point very, very well. A couple of features of populism as I've described it. One feature is divisive speech. In democracies, you would think that all speech should be inclusive. I have to run in an election, I need people to vote for me, so my first inclination, I've been a candidate twice in my life. As a candidate, your first inclination is you say, oh, everybody's lovely. I love you all, right? Because, if I love you, maybe you will love me and you will give me your vote, right? So you would expect, naively perhaps, most politicians to engage in very inclusive speech. Mandela was the paradigm of inclusive speech. Obama was the paradigm of inclusive speech. Somewhat surprisingly, at least to naive people like me, what you see today in the world is exactly the opposite. You see divisive speech. The speech of people who say, these guys are good, those guys are bad. And I just, gave you three bits and pieces. I will not read every single one of them. If you read, The Economist is very good at this, at reporting on what's going on in Hungary. The rhetoric of Orban in Hungary is textbook anti-Semitism. All the quirks and all the keys and all the turns of rhetoric of the 1930s and 40s in Europe are back if you look at the way Orban speaks. Classic, textbook, pure, unadulterated. Bolsonaro came to office promising that he was going to do away with crime. And yes, granted, Brazil has a lot of crime. So in a very impassioned and furious speech in the course of the campaign, he said, we will kill those criminals as though they were cockroaches. Not exactly inclusive speech, right? And not exactly the sort of thing you expect from a democratic leader, because criminals may be criminals, but they have political rights, right? And they're certainly not cockroaches. Or if you look at Mr. Duterte in the Philippines, there was recently a feminist convention in Manila, and the president was asked, what do you think? And he said, oh, just a bunch of crazy women, okay? Which is rather peculiar because you think that he would need the votes of women. But I think a fascinating thing is to ask precisely what is it about politics today that causes leaders not to engage in speech that brings everybody in, but in speech that keeps a few people out. Why does that make political sense? I will return to this. So, that's my take on populism, or if you wish, that's my definition of populism. What I want to do next is speculate a little bit as to why we have this. We had it in the 30s, in Latin America, you had it in the late 19th century in the US. Why now? Why here on planet Earth, right? In so many countries so different. I mean, what does Brazil have to do with Poland, and what does Poland have to do with the Philippines, and what does the Philippines have to do with Turkey, or India, or Mexico, or the US, or the UK, or Italy? Very, very different countries indeed. Similar politics. Why is that? If you just sort of pick up the international press, if you go online and read the New York Times, or, sort of a standard account, the standard account runs more or less like this. In countries like the US and the UK, over the last 25 years, the economy has not done very well. Or to the extent that it has done well, of course, for only a few. So we know that in the US and the UK, two things have happened. The first one is that income distribution has worsened, and particularly the top 1% is capturing a bigger share. We know that. And secondly, the other side of that coin is that median wages, the wage that is such that half of the wages are above it and half of the wages are below it, the median wage has been stagnating over the last 25 years in the US and the UK. So there are a lot of people who are pissed off because they expected to live much better than their parents, and they live just as well or perhaps worse than their parents or grandparents. In addition to that, we had a big financial crisis, and the big financial crisis in the US and in the UK was particularly acute, and you had two things happening at once in the financial crisis, because it was started by a mortgage crisis. Remember the subprime element in it. The upshot was that many people lost their houses, right? Because they had borrowed 100, the house was worth 200, suddenly the house was only selling for 80, so the price of the house was smaller than the size of the debt. The bank would say, please hand me over the keys. So many people lost their houses. And just as many people lost their houses, the bankers got bailed out, right? So the perception in the US and in the UK and other countries is that the bankers were helped. I'm a middle-class guy, I was not helped. I am very upset indeed. The implication of this narrative is twofold. First, it's the economy. So populism is really an economic phenomenon. And the other implication is that, well, if it's an economic phenomenon, you have to fix the economy in order to fix the politics. So get the economy to grow, impose a tax on the rich, redistribute a little bit from the rich to the poor, and you're all set. I want to argue that this, to cite Mencken, this hypothesis is simple, is clear, is sexy, but it is probably wrong. Okay? Or if I want to be a little bit more generous, it is probably incomplete. It is hard to simply conclude that. And I want to say that not simply because of academic reasons, but also because of very practical political reasons. Because we could be tempted to basically focus on the economy, do nothing about the rest, and hope that the economy will fix the politics. And I think that is an illusion, and a very dangerous illusion. Now let me be a little bit more academic, because there's a vast academic literature of people who've been saying, well, it has to be the economy. So let me give you in 30 seconds a flavor of what that debate is like. First of all, there are a lot of people trying to look at why income distribution has become worse. And it's very hard to draw a link between, say, general income distribution and things like globalization at a general level. But it is easier, and it has become easier, to look at the effect on particular places. I moved to the United Kingdom 2 years ago, and one thing that I was very struck by is that London is very rich. You go to London and everybody seems to have a Ferrari. Well, not everybody, but a lot of them, right? Take a train, go 2 hours north, and I took a train recently. I went to give a talk. I was surprised by how shoddy the train station was, and I asked, where is Starbucks? I'd like to get a cappuccino. And of course in London you get a cappuccino everywhere. 2 hours north of London, no cappuccino, no Starbucks, okay? No espresso, no latte. The difference is very, very large. So one working hypothesis is that maybe there's no general effect, but the effect is very concentrated. So if you look at Sheffield in England, so if you look at Akron, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, these post-industrial towns, maybe that's where the action is. There is a literature trying to, measure those effects, and there's a very famous paper by 3 eminent economists that shows that, in fact, you see the economic pain in those small labor markets that are very exposed to trade. Arriving at this was not easy because there's a lot of statistical complication. How do you know that the shock is exogenous? All that stuff that statisticians worry about that I will not talk about here. Now, what are the political implications? Is it true that those same labor markets are those where you find all these voters for Trump or voters for Leave in the Brexit debate? Well, there's some people in the academic world, particularly 2 Italian political scientists, who've been arguing that yes, that is true in the UK for the Brexit debate. That is also true in Europe. If you look at who votes for the extreme right-wing parties, those voters tend to be in those regions where you had a big impact of this China shock, or the impact of globalization, if you wish, okay? And of course, there are other people who've been looking at the extent to which the economy was buffeted by these financial and macro shocks. So if you look at the unemployment rate after the world financial crisis, you measure that city by city, county by county in Europe, and then you ask, are those the areas where unemployment went up most? Are those the same ones that, say, voted for the National Front in France? At first, the answer seems to be yes. Last but not least, you could ask the question, well, why is it that in Europe all the populism is right-wing, whereas in Latin America all the populism has been left-wing? Well, a very eminent economist and a friend of mine, a Harvard professor, Roderick, says, well, it's because we have different kinds of globalization. In Europe, the poor are losers from globalization. In Latin America, they tend to be winners from globalization. But Latin America has had financial crisis. If you have financial crisis, you get populism of the left. If you have globalization, you get populism of the right. That sounds promising. I'm not saying this is all entirely wrong, but let me argue that it is misleading and incomplete for at least 4 reasons, okay? I don't know if you can read that, but I'll explain it to you. The first reason why that is misleading and incomplete is that, you know how social scientists are, you know how economists and political scientists are. For any issue, you will have 20 papers on this side and 20 papers on the other side. And it's not surprising because, you know, of the old saying that some people use statistics for support, other people use statistics for illumination. So, you know, a good economist uses, you know this joke I'm sure, a good economist uses statistics like a drunk uses a lamppost for support, not for illumination, right? So give me a set of statistics and I'll give you a result. So the first thing I want to say is that if you go out and look at all these very sophisticated studies, there are some that show that yes, it's all economics in explaining Trump, it's all economics in explaining Brexit, but there are just as many papers or more who would argue that, which would argue exactly the opposite, okay? And, you know, I have a neighbor at the LSE who's Mr. Political Scientist studying this sort of thing. He said to me, these are the 2 most cited papers. One, these are the titles of the papers. One paper reads, Status Threats, Not Economic Hardship, Explain the 2016 Presidential Vote. That's the US. Vote switching in the 2016 election, how racial and immigration attitudes, not economics, explain shifts in white voting. Yeah? It is quite easy to correlate voting for Trump with other features. One that is cool, I think, or at least is worrying, but intellectually or from a statistic point of view interested, you can get data from Google to see what are the most common searches. City by city, zip code by zip code. Well, pick those zip codes where racist searches are more common and see how Trump did there. The correlation is 0.9. So some people argue that it has nothing to do with economics, or at least it is not directly related to economics, but it is culture, racist attitudes, lack of education, or some combination thereof. There's sort of a race between the scholars who say, oh, it's all culture, and the scholars who say it's all economics. It's really not clear. It's not very clear what's going on. The second reason why this is not really convincing, there's a very famous political scientist right here in Tel Aviv, at the University of Tel Aviv, who's written a bunch of very interesting studies on the subject.
I'm a faculty member in our center.
Okay. One of my favorite authors. He's really very good. He says, look, don't get confused by 2 different, the question is, what the hell are we trying to explain? If you're trying to explain why 2% or 3% or 4% of the vote went from Labour to Conservative in the UK, or why 3 or 4% of the vote went from being pro-Remain to being pro-Leave, well, maybe unemployment will help you explain. But the big question is not why 4% of the vote moved. The big question is, why is it that 52 or 54% of the population wanted to leave Europe? And for that, if you're trying to explain why is it that an apparently successful system like integration in Europe was rejected by 52% of Britons, that explanation, statistically speaking, does not do the heavy lifting, does not explain very much. So it's a second reason to be empirically skeptical of an appeal to economics alone. The third reason to be skeptical is that so far I've been talking basically about the United States, United Kingdom, and Western Europe. And that's a very Anglo-centric or a very rich world-centric approach, because you get populism in rich countries, but you also have populism in not so rich countries. Turkey, Philippines, Hungary, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, India. And of course, these countries mostly are not losers from globalization, they are huge winners from globalization. I'll give you two examples. Turkey. Turkey was another example of a country which 20 years ago was sort of, people said, oh, this is a country which is democratic, where religion is not an obstacle for democratic politics. And the West was, very keen on Turkey. Turkey is not quite an autocracy today, but it's veered very close to autocracy. Well, who knows? I didn't know it, so I had to look it up. What the rate of growth on average of the economy has been in Turkey since the world financial crisis. So from 2008 to 2018, nearly 7%. It's up there. You guessed it. So for the last 10 years, the Turkish economy has been growing at 7% per year. It's not bad, right? The Philippines. The Philippines used to be known as the sick man of Asia, a country with terrible performance, doing much worse than Korea, than Taiwan, than Malaysia, than Indonesia, etc., etc. Well, the Philippines is growing at 6.8%. Okay? So it is not obvious, and you can do regressions and do statistical analysis, that once you leave the UK and the US, these mechanistic explanations about low growth and stagnation, whatever, are really behind populism. In fact, if anything, take, say, Poland or Hungary. Of course, these are much richer countries. You wouldn't expect an upper middle income country like Hungary to grow at 7%, but they grow at 3%, 3.5% per year, which is way more than the rest of the European Union. So again, if you look at unemployment, if you look at the median wage, whatever, these are successful countries, and nonetheless, they're getting populist. And the last thing to notice is that if in fact the whole story were purely a redistribution story, well, you'd be getting a lot of left-wing populists. And the striking thing in the world today is that you're getting a lot of right-wing populists. So it is not obvious how you go from redistribution to Bolsonaro in Brazil. It is not obvious how you go from redistribution to Modi in India. Yes, a left-wing populist was elected in Mexico. Yes, we've had left-wing populism in Venezuela for a long time. But even in Latin America, Danny Roderick used to say, well, Europe is right-wing, Latin America is left-wing. Well, in Latin America today, you have Bolsonaro with extreme right-wing. And if you look at polls, there are a bunch of other people in Latin America who are looking pretty strong for elections in the next couple of years. Some of them come from a very extreme right. In Chile, there's an extreme right candidate, a really frightening guy, who is polling at 22% today. Chile is supposed to be the moderate and well-behaved country, and there's a very, very right-wing guy who's polling at 22%. Sometimes 15, 16, depending on the poll, but still, this is a very, very big change. So the idea that Latin America is left-wing populist, Europe is right-wing populist, that idea is also going down the drain. So I think these four reasons are good reasons to be very skeptical of that idea that, it's all economics. There's also a more conceptual problem here. That, you don't have to be a very sophisticated academic to understand that even if it is economics, the political impact of economic changes is going to hinge very crucially on things like culture, or on that setting, cultural, social, and otherwise, in which those economic changes happen. I'll give you an example. Income inequality is a very, very big issue today. But do you see anybody writing papers saying that Bill Gates is a crook? Not really. That Steve Jobs would the iPhone that we all have in our pockets was a crook? Not really. Why? Because there's an underlying sense that these guys are very, very rich, but they got their money fairly. If you like football, which I do, footballers make 100 million euros, 150 million euros a year, and nobody says, oh, that guy is a crook. Raise taxes on him. Why? Because we have a sense that there's fairness. So it matters a lot whether the money that causes the distribution of income to be bad was earned one way or the other way. It also matters, for instance, who's getting rich. For instance, in South Africa, since since the restoration of democracy, not restoration, since the creation of democracy in South Africa, the income distribution has increased in some dimensions and worsened in some others. But what's happened? In South Africa, once upon a time, all the rich people were white and all the poor people were not white. What's happened since is the creation of a rich black bourgeoisie, right? And you see most people lamenting that? Not necessarily, because, you know, if I'm black and I never saw a rich person who was black, and suddenly there are some people who've done well who are black, I'm proud of that. I'm not necessarily upset. Even though, from the point of view of the Gini coefficient or whatever, some measure of inequality, that's probably not helping. So even if you believe that economics is at the very root of some of these problems, unless you can tell me a story of how we go from economics to society and culture and from there to politics, you're not telling me a very convincing story. I need the whole account. And I can tell you stories in which one shock will have one political effect, and in a different cultural setting, the same shock can have a different political effect. And that's why we need a more complete account. Economics alone will not do it. So, I've told you what I think populism is. I've told you what I don't think accounts for populism. That's an exclusive and sole focus on economics. Let me suggest one other element that is key in trying to understand populism. And this I'm going to call identity politics. I'm certainly not the only person today to be talking about identity politics. Many political scientists, economists, philosophers are doing the same thing. And this comes from at least two sort of empirical observations. Empirical observation number one is that if you go back to the description of populism that I gave you, populism is always about identity, because it's about some good group, the people, and some bad group. It could be the elite, it could be the others, the migrants, the foreigners, etc. So implicit in that way of approaching politics, there's always identities. There's us versus them, the good guys, the bad guys. So in a very basic sense, you cannot think about populism without resorting in one way or another to what I will call identity. The other reason why identity is important, and you're going to see this in the academic literature, is that democracies historically developed in countries which had very strong shared identities. There's a young political scientist at Harvard, a guy called Yasha Monk, who was born in Germany, but he's lived in the US for a number of years, who makes an observation which is not 100% true, but it is mostly true and very suggestive. He says, in history, particularly in Western Europe, democracy developed in countries that were very culturally and socially homogeneous. Now, it's easy to be, I will be somewhat unfair here, and engage in a caricature. It's easy to be democratic if you're Denmark, right? Small, very homogeneous, and of course, fairly rich. The exception is the United States. But the United States, even though it is large and it is diverse culturally and ethnically, the United States is a country that has spent a lot of money and effort building a common identity. I arrived in the US when I was 16 because my family was exiled from Chile, and I arrived there in American school, and the first thing that I was told is you have to take a class in American civics. And I was forced to learn everything about American history and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Supreme Court, etc. I hadn't been there for 3 months, and I was an expert, because that was very much what Americans do to you when you arrive there. I have a colleague in the LSE, an Italian economist called Oriana Bandiera, and she's been writing about educational expenditures in the US over the last 150 years. And what strikes you is that when, the moment when public money going to education arose in the US, you see a real break in the trend, is precisely in the beginning of the 20th century. So at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th. Why was that? What happened around that time?
Immigration.
That was the big influx of immigration. First the Irish, then the Italian, then the Poles, then Central Europeans, Eastern Europeans, etc., right? And why was the money needed? You could have said to the immigrants, do your own thing. Because Americans were very keen on making sure that immigrants developed a shared identity. So immigrants, have to learn the Star-Spangled Banner and learn English and blah, 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 blah. In the United Kingdom, and to some extent in the US, and there's a beautiful poll by the Oxford economist Paul Collier, this, the UK is a different country from the US, not as big, but much more classy. driven, right? In the UK, people are very conscious of where you stand in the world. Moving to the UK, I thought it was very funny. In most countries of the world, when you go online and you need to fill up an online form, you can be Mr. or Mrs. or Miss. There are three alternatives, right? In the UK, you can be Mr. or Mrs. or Miss or Professor or, Your Excellency or Lord or Dame or, there are like 19 alternatives. The Brits are very clear on who's who, where you are in the food chain. But the UK had a blessing in disguise. The UK won 2 world wars. And what happened in the world wars, particularly in the First World War? The children of the aristocracy and the children of the working class were in the same trench. And this generated a sense of solidarity and a sense of a shared enterprise. So democracies historically happen in countries in which you either were small and homogeneous and share an identity, or in which you could be large and not so homogeneous like the US or the UK, but because of either policy or history, you had a sense of we are in this together. Of course, the US also fought 2 world wars and was on the winning side of both, so that this also is an argument that is to some extent relevant for the United States. Now, today, none of that is true. There's no overarching sense of shared project in the US and the UK. And of course, other countries which are not so small, not so homogeneous, and don't have very shared identities, think of India, think of Turkey, think of Brazil, think of Mexico, are now democratic. So the question is, how do you sustain democracy in countries in which identities are fragmented, are divergent, and sometimes are very much opposed to each other? There are lots of economists who've been writing about this, and the 2 people that, if you want to do a little reading and a little scrounging around, the people you want to read is a guy who won the Nobel Prize called George Akerlof, and his co-author, a woman called Rachel Cranton. When I went to school 25, 30 years ago, economists never used the word identity. The word identity was left for, sociologists, people that economists wouldn't have lunch with, right? We were told that people had preferences. You like butter, or you like guns, you like peaches, or you like oranges. What the hell is an identity? Well, we economists have learned that the sociologists were right, and the political scientists were right, and the anthropologists were right. Identity is a very useful category for thinking about human affairs. And the way Akerlof thinks about it, Akerlof is an economist, he says, look, we human beings get utility, get happiness from consumption. I like to have, a nice jacket and a nice cup of coffee and a nice house. But we also get a lot of utility from belonging to groups where people think highly of us. Right? We are very social animals. We're very tribal animals. We live in society, and we care hugely about what it is that other people think of us. And as a result, we're likely to do 2 things. First of all, we're likely to follow group norms. And secondly, we're likely to follow group norms because that makes us happy, even though that might have an economic cost. If I'm a Latino migrant to the United States and I live in a barrio in Texas, well, maybe all my neighbors speak Spanish, and maybe they make fun of me if I speak English. And I could choose not to learn English even though I live in the United States, because that enhances my identity as a Mexican migrant. Even though from an economic point of view it's going to be terrible, because many jobs I could get in Texas would require my speaking English. So in a situation in which there's a tension between identity and economic efficiency, we human beings often choose identity to the detriment of economic efficiency. If you begin to think along these lines, then identity is a very useful thing indeed. I've been working with a dear friend, a guy called Ricardo Hausman, who's a professor at Harvard, on models of this sort. And don't worry, I will not write any equations for you or show any fancy statistics. But I'll just tell you, what this way of thinking is like. Imagine that, there are a bunch of people out there, some rich, some poor, some white, some black. And, these are human beings which derive utility from consumption, but also from belonging to a group. Well, it is not, and of course, belonging to a group may entail benefits. I belong to a group and, I feel surrounded by people like me. But it may also involve costs. For instance, if I'm a black kid and I go to a fancy boarding school in England, well, I would probably feel discriminated. People will look at me funny, and there's some cost, there's some tension, there's some friction associated with joining the elite or joining the middle class if you come from the underclass. Well, it's not hard to write economic models in which people will sort themselves into these groups, depending on their preferences, depending on what they look like or what their background is. You may choose to say, I am a proud member of the working class, or I'm a proud member of the middle class, or I'm a proud member of the elite, if you can afford to be in the elite and if the elite will let you in. And people may choose to be members of the working class even when it entails an economic cost. You know, if you go to the north of England, people will say, I would never move to London even though there are jobs there because I'm from the north of England and I'm proud that my parents or my grandparents worked in a mill. And I really don't care for those, you know, London is full of immigrants and, you know, people with funny jobs. I am a working class Englishman from the north. I would never move south. For identity, that's great. For economics, that's terrible. This kind of model gives you a good explanation of why you see politicians engaging in divisive speech. And there are at least 3 reasons in this kind of world why you may engage in divisive speech. You know, suppose that I am the leader of the middle class, or I'm the leader of the elite, and I can say nice things about the other social groups, or I can say bad things about the other social group. Well, I could maybe encourage my followers. I'm Trump, and I will say nasty things about Mexicans, maybe because white people in the US enjoy making fun of Mexicans. But that's not a very appealing feature, right? Because you think that human beings at heart maybe are okay, they're not mean, they don't enjoy making fun of other people. But there could be at least 2 other reasons. Maybe, for instance, you want to make fun of other people because you want to change the size of the other group. Imagine a country in which, for instance, the rich have to engage in a lot of transfers to the poor or to the underclass. Well, you don't want the underclass to be very large because they're going to be very expensive for you. And as a result, you make it very expensive to belong to the underclass, and you engage in divisive speech. And that could also be an electoral motivation because you need a lot of votes to win, and you don't want the other guys to vote for the other candidate, so you say nasty things about that group so that the group will shrink, and therefore support for your competitor in an election will also shrink. So there are many ways, and I don't want to go into the details here, I'll be happy to entertain questions. There are many ways in which, in a world in which you have these identities, and in which you have a tension between belonging to a group and getting economic benefits, politicians who lead these groups will engage in divisive speech and in the sort of a politics that detracts from legitimacy of the other groups, which is exactly, of course, what is so typical of populism in the world today. Let me skip that. And let me say one other thing. I began by saying that it was very hard to understand why you get economic populism in the world. If it's pretty evident that your government is running the economy into the ground, as, say, Chavez did in Venezuela, or as the Peronists have done in Argentina 1,000,000 times, why do people keep voting for them? If it's obvious that these guys, every time they come to power, they muck up the economy, well, why the hell would I vote for them? If you think in terms of sort of classical political theory or classical economics, there's no explanation for that. But once you begin to think about identity, it makes a lot of sense. And there are a bunch of papers, surprise, surprise, written mostly by Argentines, Argentines living in the US or in the UK, who've tried to explain that, and the reason is very simple. Suppose that I have an identity, I belong to the working class, and I have a suspicion that this candidate, even though he claims to be in favor of the working class, is really working for the rich elite or the rich oligarchy. What is the only way in which the candidate can signal to me that I'm actually his guy, that he's working for me? Well, if you know something about signaling theory in economics, signaling theory is all about doing something that is costly. Simply saying, we're friends. Anybody can say we're friends. I have to do something that is painful to signal to you that I'm your friend. And in this case, what do? Well, I follow a policy that is very left-wing, even though it is economically costly, because it's the only way that I can persuade you that I'm really left-wing and I'm really with you and we're both men of the people and we're both against the bad guys. So you can imagine situations in which people, again, are willing to incur an economic cost for the sake of an identity cost. For the sake of an identity benefit. What's the identity benefit? Well, I need to be persuaded that this guy is in fact my kind of politician, not the other guy's kind of politician. Let me then begin to wrap up. I've said a lot of things, and I've spent a lot of time, and I want to make sure that we have some time to discuss. First, some recap, and then a few minutes on solutions. The first thing that I want you to remember is that if you define populism in the political way that I've defined it today, then populism is not a corrective to the failings of democracy. Populism is very much a threat to democracy, because the very essence of populism is about a denial of complexity, a denial of pluralism, and a rejection of democratic checks and balances. And that is not simply a coincidence, that is of the essence of the populistic way of doing politics. If you believe that, then we need solutions. And if you believe that identity is behind populism, then what we need to do is to think about identity politics in a good way. I've been describing identity politics as a bad thing, but it need not be a bad thing. Identity can also be a force for good. Let me say something that is not on this slide, because it occurred to me recently. You will all know that Esther Duflo, the French economist, won the Nobel Prize 2 weeks ago. She wrote an amazing paper, very interesting, not very well known, about gender quotas in state elections in India. Suppose you're an Indian woman, and there's a male candidate that says, I'm really all for, the rights of women. How do you know that the guy is really not cheating, right? Well, a fairly safe way of knowing that a candidate is for the rights of women is to do what? To elect a woman. And of course, women voting for women is a kind of identity politics, but maybe a kind of healthy identity politics. And in fact, she did a very sophisticated statistical exercise of what happens to legislation in issues that are interesting to women, are important to women, in those states in India which have quotas, and in which therefore you have a minimum share of women in parliament, in the state parliament. And she finds that, surprise, surprise, in those states in which you have more women in parliament because you have quotas, well, you have more legislation that is pro-women. So that's a case in which identity is not bad, identity is in fact good. So the question that I want to kind of leave with you guys is, how do we use identity as a force for good, as opposed to identity as a force for bad? I gave you a hint already when I talked about, say, the United Kingdom and the rich guy and the poor guy in the trench. There are moments in countries' history in which the fragmented identities, the racial identities, the class identities, the socioeconomic identities are subordinated to something greater, which is a national identity.
Usually it's a tragedy.
Sorry?
Usually it's a tragedy.
Yeah, that's exactly the question. Does it have to be? Let me argue that it doesn't have to be. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Yes, in the case of the UK, of course it was a tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that war in the UK, and many, many more millions elsewhere. But I would like to argue that there are other circumstances in which countries have had some success at building a shared identity, which is the healthy kind. And here I want to reflect for a minute on the role of the nation state and on the role of, where does politics happen? Because we are in a world of globalization, and globalization is a fashionable subject, and we all talk about globalization, and we look at the UN, and we talk about the EU, and we talk about, transnational corporations, there's kind of a feeling out there, a wrong feeling in my view, that politics has transcended the nation state and that politics happens out there in, the global arena. That's wrong. If you've ever been a politician, and you've gone out and sought votes from actual people, people really don't, they might care about international affairs insofar they affect their daily lives. And of course, in a country like Israel, where security is so key, clearly Israel has to think about what's going on beyond Israel's borders. But aside from that very direct and personal effect, politics is not international. Politics is really local. My wife is a television anchor woman, and when she does her show, she has online ratings, minute by minute, of how many people are watching the show. when they do local news, when they do crime, of course, but when they do football, wham, you get massive increase in ratings. When you go to international news, you get a massive decrease in ratings. And this is a kind of a highbrow station, a highbrow program. So even for the highbrow public, when international news comes to the fore, people switch channels. Okay? So what am I trying to say? The relevant arena for identities, in spite of globalization, in spite of the UN, in spite of the EU, remains the nation state. And the question is, to what extent are we capable today, and we're nearly in 2020, in the year 2020, to build national identities which are not nationalistic in the bad sense of the word. There's a beautiful essay by George Orwell, written after the Spanish Civil Wars, in which Orwell distinguishes between nationalism and patriotism, and says nationalism is the hatred of the other. Patriotism is the love of my own. I think that sounds somewhat trivial, but it is very powerful. Patriotism is not the same thing as nationalism. Nationalism can be toxic, patriotism need not be. But the key, of course, is to have a patriotism that is not founded on race, or on class, or on ethnicity, or in religion, but in common shared values, universal values, liberal values. And I think there are two political leaders in the world today who understand this and are doing it. Whether they will be successful eventually or not, I do not know. Those two political leaders are Macron in France and Trudeau in Canada. If you look at their speeches, and Trudeau is very good at this, he says, look, in Canada there's a big debate over immigration, right? And the right says to Trudeau, oh, you're not Canadian because you're so pro-immigrant. And Trudeau replies, you guys don't understand what it means to be Canadian. Canada has more migrants per capita than most other countries in the world. And we've been receiving migrants for 150 years. Therefore, it is the very essence of what it means to be Canadian to be open to migration. And if you're a true Canadian patriot, you cannot be against migration because Canada has had migration all of its history. And one of the great achievements of Canada is that even though Canada is diverse, and even though Canada is in fact very open to migration, Canadians live side by side in peace. Macron says exactly the same thing about France. He says, I'm a French patriot not because we're good at football, which is not really, no, because France is rich or because there's 200 kinds of cheese. No, it is because France is the heir to the French Revolution and to those universal values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. This, of course, is not new. The great political leaders in history have understood this very well. There's a beautiful book by an American political philosopher, a woman called Martha Nussbaum, in which he asks the question, what do Lincoln and Gandhi and Martin Luther King have in common? And she says, what they have in common is they understood the role of emotion in politics and the role of love in politics. Because if you look at, say, the Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, it was remarkable in two dimensions. First of all, how short it is. It is 3 minutes long. And secondly, how extraordinarily emotional it is. Here's a guy who is talking about the dead and about honoring the dead in a way that is absolutely unforgettable, and it is in 3 minutes. And the way Lincoln carried himself, at a time of a civil war, a very bloody civil war, was a way in which very much he wanted to establish a new American identity, post-Civil War. The guy was not necessarily poor, but he lived very frugally. He lived in a log cabin. He did not dress in any fancy clothes. He dressed in very coarse woolen clothes because he was trying to build an American identity of shared values in a country that had been torn by civil war. Gandhi. If you go to South Africa ever, and you see pictures of Gandhi when he lived in South Africa, he was an upper middle class barrister who was wearing coat and tie, right? And you see him as the leader in India at the time of partition and independence, and he's the guy wearing a loincloth. Was that a coincidence? No, that was very deliberate. Why? Because Gandhi was very aware that after independence, a joint identity had to be forged in a country of hundreds of millions of people, in which dozens of languages and at least 3 major religions have room. And as a result, he was very busy putting together a set of values and symbols that could be shared by Indians, but which were not for Hindus alone, for Muslims alone, for Sikhs alone. And that is the talent of Gandhi. So the question that Martha asks is, how can modern leaders do exactly that? Understand that we cannot leave emotion to the populist, understand that we cannot leave patriotism to the populist, we cannot leave love, use the word love to the populist, but we need to use emotion and patriotism and love in ways that create a shared identity, a shared national identity which is not nationalistic. If we can do that successfully, I think we have some hope of beating the populist. If we can't do that, I'm afraid the populist will prevail. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Shall I? So now we'll move to the Q&A part. If they feel free to ask in Hebrew, and I'll translate if you don't have the will to speak in English. So if anyone has questions,
Can
please.
I suggest that we ask Yuli to sort of to talk about, to reciprocate, because her last book is
Please do.
corresponds, I think, greatly with speaking about the positive side of nationalism. Okay?
Please do.
If it's okay with you.
Yeah.
No. I can speak for me. I have loud voice. מאוד בגדרים. Now she's going to say it because I'm not feminist enough that I Is that okay? Okay. I'm really afraid of my wife. Yeah, this is really taking me by surprise.
Those are the best interventions.
Right.
I'm surprised.
Well, certainly I don't have lots of disagreements. I just finished a book called Why Nationalism that actually tries to answer the questions you've just raised. And actually looking at the same
Is it
kind...
in English or in Hebrew?
In English,
Okay.
Princeton University Press. I give a copy there.
I am a lucky guy, thank you.
I didn't know where Rob would put me here, but I really would have liked you to read it. And I think that for me the most fascinating thing is how much we're not... I'm a political theorist. I teach at the Blavatnik. I'm always surprised how we don't sort of converse across disciplines. Because identity is a very old theme in political theory. And nationalism...
We economists came late to the party.
I know.
Right.
Yeah, that's the problem.
We often do.
So I really just want to say two things. First of all, that I truly agree that identity politics is the issue now. And that we are all asking the same questions. How can liberal democratic forces engage in some identity-forming procedures that would be helpful to recreate what I called in my book a social contract or a cross-class coalition that was typical of the nation state. I think, unfortunately, we lost some of our tools during the period that maybe started in the 60s or 70s when we were all, because of you guys, supportive of a very thin state that is non-interventional and that leaves everything for...
You guys being the evil economists?
Yeah, so not Chileans. I'm nothing against people from
Well, you know, we had Chicago boys who were the most non-interventionists of them all, so...
So I do think that we have developed too much of self-restraint from state intervention. And as you rightly said, unless you identity is fabricated, and unless you create it, it's not going to be there and it's not going to hold. So we will have to compromise some of our liberal assumptions also in order to move ahead. So that's, I think, and it's a very, very delicate thing. Moving back is probably the hardest thing to do. They know, but you don't. I've been the Minister of both the Minister of Immigration and the Minister of Education here, and trying to recreate national education is a hell of a job. The second thing is that it takes me to the first part of your talk, which was extremely interesting. Thank you. I wrote all my notes. I'll review them later. But I think that populism is now reappearing because of this convergence of economics and identity. And it's never one thing. I mean, social movements are never motivated by one thing. So I fear the attack of populism that puts it like in the corner, like you guys are providing us the simple answer and therefore it's wrong. I think no. The reason the real question is this: why identities surface now? Because it's as old as the Jewish people, and it is surfacing now. So the now question, I think, has a lot to do with the economy, and I hope you won't be disappointed. Danny Roderick wrote the introduction to my book, so I'm in the Danny Roderick camp. But I think
when I was in secondary school, Danny was my next door neighbor and my best friend, so he and I have an ongoing dialogue on these things.
So this is really, I think, the question. There's a question about why now, and the question is how to really move ahead. And that's the $64,000 question. None of us know how to do it, but at least I think we allow ourselves to ask the question, which is not a minor thing to do. I've been writing on nationalism since the 90s. And I know when I'm excluded in the economic debate, and I know when I'm in the academic debate, and I know when I'm included. So I've been re-included in the debate because talking about saying what you said at the end, which I wholeheartedly agree, is legitimate now, and it wasn't 5-6 years ago. So it's a beginning, and I'm sort of mildly optimistic that asking the right question will give you the right answers.
Wonderful. Can I react to that very briefly? Again, I agree with practically everything you said, but let me raise 2 points in the spirit of digging a little deeper. Purely on grounds of political theory, you said something which intrigued me. You said we may have to compromise our liberalism somewhat. And I imagine by that you did not mean your economic liberalism. I imagine you meant your Rawlsian liberalism. I think a very interesting question for political philosophers. I am not a political philosopher, but I've written extensively with a political philosopher, so I'm a political philosopher wannabe. Can there be a progressive liberalism which is not neutral on these questions? In my mind, the real weakness, politically speaking, of liberalism is that liberalism is very shy when it comes to saying things about the good life. If you go back to Aristotle, Aristotle was all about politics as a form of virtue. Politicians were good when they stood in a box and said, this is the good and virtuous life. We liberals don't like to say that because, we tend to assume, well, if you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim, that's your problem. If you're gay or straight, that's your problem. Your definition of the good life is yours. Who am I to prescribe a definition of a good life to you? That's perfectly fine. But when you become a practicing politician, which you have been and I have been, we know perfectly well that a political speech which is not about values and which is not about the good life is a very bad political speech. So what values which are not illiberal can we appeal to as liberals that make us, on the one hand, still liberal politicians, but effective liberal politicians? I would like to think that there's a set of liberal values that we share. Ross spoke of the overlapping consensus, you will remember, which we can talk about. If that sounds too abstract, let me put it more concretely. If I get in a soapbox and say, the great thing about the Canadian state is that people with different colors of skin can live side by side in peace. That's not shy about values, but it's not illiberal. Right? And I would like to think that we can do something like that. So that's one provocation. The other provocation is purely on economics. I'm perfectly willing to shoulder a lot of blame because economists are, A, boring, and B, imperialist, and that's a very bad combination. But I'm not sure what is it, and this is the conversation that I've had with Danny Roderick for decades. What is it about economics that triggers populism today, because as I hinted in my remarks, yes, it's evident that today, you know, if I were in Akron, Ohio, or Sheffield, England, and I looked at my city 30 years ago or 100 years ago, and I looked at it today, I would be a populist too, right? But if I go to Ankara or Istanbul or Manila or you know, Sao Paulo, these are cities in which people are much richer, in which equality is much higher, in which globalization has made you win massively, and populism is also taking off. So I sometimes worry there's a little bit of sort of Anglo-American imperialism in those discussions, that, you know, that view of the world has colored the way we think about the world. So that's the second provocation.
Can I just say one thing
Yeah,
about the
yeah.
first one? I don't have an answer to the second. I'm thinking on the second one, but I don't.
On the first one, you're a political philosopher. I'm not. So I'm curious to say what.
So you know, I think that purism, ideological purism, is a disaster. I'm a student of Hazara Berlin. I don't believe that, you know, taking the ideas to the logical conclusion is a good advice.
Well, you're at Oxford, Berlin's home, so
Yeah.
that's.
He was my tutor. Actually. He was my supervisor for my PhD.
What a lucky.
Yeah,
Very
it's a
lucky
lucky
experience.
a stroke of luck. For
Should we
one,
leave?
no, for one reason, you know, nobody wanted to tutor a dissertation on nationalism. Until I met Berlin, and I said, you know, nobody wants to do it. He says, well, nationalism is important. Come, I'll take you on board, and that's how he became my tutor. But I think he got it right. For me, he's less well read right now. I love Rawls. I think, you know, he got it right in many ways. But I think Berlin's notion of anti-compromises, being ready to compromise even your liberal values, at some point, in order to survive in a more cohesive way that would create some solution, is a necessary step ahead. And you know, and when I write, my first book was called Liberal Nationalism. When I write it, it's all about how you compromise things. And unless you're ready to compromise, you will not offer a workable solution. That's it. Sorry.
Fascinating.
כן, זה שאלות, מישהו?
I would like to say that, from my perspective, the failure of, or the problems of liberal democracies today is pretty much about too much internationalism, too much rationalism, and too much individualism. And that takes out the emotional aspect of politics. So if, you know, liberal Democrats, people want to be more influential, they need to be more emotional. And to combine emotions with rationalism, well, that's pretty hard.
Completely agree. Completely agree. You know, the old joke that war is too important to be left to the generals. Well, you could think of an analog. You know, emotion is too important to be left to the populists. Now the thing is, the difficulty is, as our remarks suggest, to be emotional about what? Because there's a cheap and vulgar and toxic kind of emotion. It's very easy to incite emotion, say, look at that guy, he looks different than me. And we don't want that kind of emotion. It is much harder to incite emotion by saying, he looks different, but he's one of us anyway. And that's where the talent of the Gandhis and the talent of the Lincolns and the talent of the Mandelas really shows up. And there are very, very, very few political leaders who can accomplish it.
It's a bit tough to talk about two giants, so I'll try to make a short point. This room is full of agendas. Everyone here has an agenda that he might need to drop or to give up. And from speaking with some of the people here, it sometimes seems like the price of losing your agenda is too high, and we are used to lose the elections again and again. So to give up the agenda for something which is not even 50% certain.
Come on, we love it.
That's exactly the problem.
Which bits of your agenda are you worried that you might have to drop?
So
Give me an example.
Some people here will have an agenda to have reformic in terms of religious state, have women in the Western wall. Some others will say we want to remove all the radical extremists from the right, the Kahana and the Kach in Israel, who called to kill Arabs. I mean, everyone here has his own fight, and some of these fights certainly eliminate or distract a lot of the people in Israel. So my question is, what would be your tip to a room full of agendas where most of the people would not be willing to take the risk?
Oh, that's a hard one. Let me reply in a very oblique way, but hopefully not an entirely useless way. I was part of the group that negotiated the transition between dictatorship and democracy in my country 25 years ago, nearly 30 years ago. I'm 59 today, so I was 29 then. I was one of the youngsters. In a very different set of circumstances, we faced exactly the question that you're asking. Because to get rid of a dictator without a civil war, without a coup, without a revolution, you have to give up on a lot of your agendas. And I think in Chile we did, and we got it right, in the sense that we made compromises and sacrifices that they seemed right to me then, they seem right to me now. I'll give you a few examples. There was an amnesty law that prevented us from looking into the crimes of dictatorship. We did not lift the amnesty. Although clever lawyers found their way around the amnesty, but the amnesty would never lift it. And there had been lots of privatizations, many of which had not been quite clean, and there was a political deal not to revisit those. I think, with the benefit of hindsight, giving up on some agendas for the sake of the greater good was absolutely wise, and it gave Chile 30 years of peace and prosperity. The only difficulty, and I'm sure you're all aware because you read the press that Chile is going through a very tremendous period today, the only difficulty is that that sacrifice or that compromise or that dropping of the agendas is very clearly appreciated by people who are of my generation. It is not at all appreciated by people of your generation. Because the people of your generation say, you guys could have, engineered a return to democracy, plus you could have done all these things, and if you didn't, you're a bunch of cowards and wimps. And my reply is, of course, you weren't there at the time, right? So the difficulty is not so much in giving up today. The difficulty is, if you give up today and you succeed today, how do you explain that to the people who come later? Because you don't want, politics is all about compromise, right? Berlin, for the sake of living together side by side, we have to give up a lot of things. We may even have to give up our liberalism. And at the time, when you've got people pointing guns at you, it seems wise to do so. And in retrospect, I think it was wise. Go explain that to your grandson. And so that's one of the reasons why countries are, destined to step on the same stone more than once, and trip on the same stone more than once. Because what may seem like a wise compromise at some point may seem very unwise later. That's not quite an answer, but maybe it'll help you think about the issue slightly.
We have just a few more minutes of 2 more questions, so please keep it short so we have the time. Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you. It was fascinating. There's a whole kind of area of the problem which was not covered, and I wonder, was it kind of out of understanding that it's redundant compared to the ones that we did cover, or for another reason? And by this I mean the structure of the system. Populism is all about rebellion against the system, i.e. the democratic system, not only the economic and everything you said. It's the crux of the democratic system, representative democracy. Those up there do not represent us anymore. So, to me, that points to a direction of solutions, a whole array of solutions that goes into the nature of the system. Representative democracy versus other types of democracy, plus the branches of government. are the separation of three branches of government, is it good enough? Or do we need to make changes there too? So this whole kind of area of the structure of democracy, is it not part of the solution? Because it's obviously part of the problem.
I'll jump in, but please chime in as well. You're absolutely right. It is very hard to understand what's going on the world today without noticing that if you look at polling evidence, people don't like democracy and they don't like the leaders of that democracy all across the world. This guy Monk, whom I cited, the political scientist, has done lots of surveys in the US. And it is amazing, One naively might think that the United States is not exactly a failed democracy. And nonetheless, in the current generation, more than ever, there are people who say, well, democracy is not necessarily the best form of government. If you look at Ipsos Mori, the big British polling firm that does comparable polls across the world, they do it in something like 50 or 60 countries, they've been asking the question, do you trust parliament? Do you trust political parties? Do you trust judges? All those indicators are down massively, including in countries in which democracy is reasonably successful, like my own country. So the question is, why the hell, right? And what do we do about it? I don't have a short, pithy answer, but let me give you a couple of thoughts. You asked why when, and why is it that now is a problem? The reason why I focus on identity politics is that I think that it is the clash between lack of political legitimacy and rise of identities that is giving you that loss of success of democracy. Because representative democracy was invented 300 years ago, right? And the tension between the three branches of government, the tension between the elite that sits in parliament and the average man on the street, that's not new. So what is it about today that makes that tension so much sharper? And I think twofold. A, the strengthening of identities, so that people look at the guys in parliament and they say, they don't look like me. Secondly, the rise of technology, because clearly we communicate in different ways. Parliament, the word parliament, of course, has roots in antiquity. It comes from the word for speaking, right? And I am of a generation where we love speech making. My teenage children hate speech making, and therefore it's not quite clear what the root is, but that matters also. Last but not least, I think I wouldn't go as far as to say that representative democracy is doomed, but I would say that the weaknesses in representative democracy are more evident today than they have been. I'll give you an example. Because the world has become more connected and more educated, the checks and balances on democratic power are ever more present. So if you are the mayor of a city and you'd like to build a new dump to put the rubbish, it's going to take you 3 years of checks and balances until you can find a place where you can build a dump and put the rubbish, because we all want rubbish, but we don't want it where I live. I want someplace else. So more democracy means more delay. On the other hand, because of iPhones and Twitter and Facebook, if there's rubbish on the street, people will know in 30 seconds. They will take a picture, they will upload it. So the mayor will be caught between the more democracy, that means that he has to go more slowly, and the demands of communication that call on him to go more quickly. That tension is very, very hard to resolve. The other tension that is very hard to resolve is that that representative democracy is about sending people to parliament to write laws. But we live today under the pretense, to some extent because of TV first and the internet now, that democracy is all about being near the voter. I ran for election in my country, and I know exactly what happens when you go campaigning at election time. You go to a local market, and people say, maybe in Israel it's the same, they say, oh, it must be election time. The politicians are out. We haven't seen you for 4 years, right? And you have to apologize and say, well, you know, it's not true that I was here 4 years ago. I did come 2 years ago. But it's crazy that we should be apologizing because, you know, being a member of parliament is not about being in the market all the time. You're supposed to be in parliament writing laws. But what happens, the good parliamentarians, the ones who spend a lot of time writing laws, don't get re-elected. And the bad parliamentarians who spend all the time in the market are the ones who do. So you end up with parliaments that are more popular, but at the same time much more ineffective. And because they're ineffective, they eventually also become unpopular. So there is much room, I think, for marrying technology with political practice in ways that bridge that divide. But it's not easy to do.
Before we gather our hands to Professor Velesco and Professor Tamir and to you all, we opened this day with In der Nacht from Kafka, and I think it's only apt to close with the same quote. Kafka says in the end of this very short story, at night, and you are watching, you are one of the watchmen. You find the next one by brandishing a burning stick from the brushwood pile beside you. Why are you watching? Someone must watch. Someone must be there. So thank you for being with us today. We're going to continue in the days to come. Thank you very much.
Okay, so